Could you just switch this way?
I was looking at the mic. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 1 of our Quilt Sampler 2022 sew along. This week will be a little bit longer than the next weeks because I do want to go over a few things about the fabric and cutting, etc. That we can do this once and then it should be fine. We don't have to revisit that. There was a comment. Hello, everybody that was waiting for me. That was pretty cool. There was a comment that the link for the description or the fabric requirements didn't work. Is that in our email or was that in our YouTube channel? If you could comment for Tiff. I know our email did not work. I thought I was doing really great yesterday and putting a button in it and it didn't work. So we're going to resend the email.
You may have to be part of the group in order to see the file.
Okay, so you might have to join the group before you can see the file as well on Facebook. So if you are already a member of Facebook, just search out the groups, and it is Quilt Sampler Sew Along 2022 is the group that you want to look for, and make sure that you join the group, and then you'll have access to the files, etc.
Please give us a like if you can hear us today.
So we're depending on your comments. Again, because this is our first week, we want to make sure everything's good. So here goes. So we've had a couple questions about fabric requirements. And I'm going to go over those right now. So when I had thought about blocks, I had thought about my fat quarter bundle that has lights and darks and mediums in it that I was going to use. So some of those lights will be my background for my blocks. Not thinking about you ladies that had a fat quarter bundle that didn't have any backgrounds that you needed to add in. So I'm thinking you might want a couple fat quarters if you want a few different ones, or maybe even like a half a meter of backgrounds might do it enough for you for your blocks. If you can you zoom in down here, Tiff? I just want to show you what the block is. So this right here is the actual block. And this is block number 1. And this is the one that we're going to be doing today. This block here is our chain block. So in the fabrics requirements, I said right here is the chain block setting, and it was a light and a dark for the backgrounds. That's what that measurements were for. So it's just for the chain blocks. So if you need background fabrics in your block, you will need to have something. And I wouldn't necessarily want to use the same that's in my chain block, but it could definitely work as well, because then you would have star sky and you'd never know where one block ended and one block started. So that might be kind of neat.
Okay, so they said on the Facebook group they were able to get and print cutting instructions.
Awesome.
Marilyn Coon says hi from Pennsylvania.
Oh my goodness. Hello, Marilyn. How's your weather down there? It's quite cold here.
Yeah, and they can hear us today, so that's
awesome.
News.
Awesome. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So anyways, fabric requirements. That's one thing to tell me too. Tell me where you're from. I'd love to know where this is going out to and who's taking part in our sew along, just for curiosity's sake. Okay, so you can see this first part here. It says chain block, whether it was a 12 block or a 24 block queen that you're doing. Then there is the hourglass setting. That's an or. If you don't want to do the chain block, an easier setting would be the hourglass block. So it's not both. You're going to have to choose another. We're going to talk more about settings later on. We're just going to concentrate right now on the blocks. Now, because, oh, where's my paper? Here it is. I think I have it here. So we're just going to move our quilt and we're going to go to our cutting instructions, and I'm going to go over a little bit with you on my methods of cutting because we do have some beginner people. And I don't know about you, if you remember when you started sewing, our cutting is one of the most stressful things to do. We have these beautiful pieces of fabric, and once we cut it, it's no good for anything anymore. So we're going to help reduce some of the stress on that, and we're going to go over a couple of my methods for cutting. Let's see. So one other thing that we want to do, hopefully you did or you might want to do later, is do yourself that sample. Check out my YouTube channel for my 1/4-inch seam. I just tested myself again. I have a new foot, a clear 1/4-inch foot on my sewing machine. So because it's a new foot and I'm starting a new project, I wanted to do a test my seams again. And in a real, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a hi from Walford, from Elliott Lake, from Snowy Eyre, Ontario, from Sun City Center, Florida.
Oh, wow.
From Manitoulin, from Frankfurt, Ontario, from Duplessis Road, from Lively, Elliott Lake, Manitoulin Island, and from Arthur, Ontario.
Arthur, where's Arthur?
Sure.
That's pretty cool.
That is Janice Walsh.
Oh, hello, Janice. So just to go over really, really quick, now I do have on this YouTube channel how to perfect your 1/4-inch seam, and I got into it depending on what your sewing machine is or not. But really quick, I took 3 1.5-inch strips to get cut 3 1.5-inch strips, sewed them together, and when I measure it, you can see that middle strip measures exactly 1 inch, and the whole unit measures 3.5. So I'm good to go. I know where I'm going to place my fabric so we can start cutting. I also put a new needle in my machine. I wasn't sure how old that one was, so we put a new needle in my machine. So we're going to cut the blue fabric, which is our color B, on my paper. I'm just going to hold this up again so Tiff doesn't have to move the fat camera. And we're just going to go over some of the things here. So on my link, you can see that it's color A, color B, color C, and we're going to cut the 2 5-inch squares. And then I just put beside it what they're for. So HST, you might want to make a note somewhere so these short forms, you'll know what they are. HST is a half square triangle. And of course, that's our center block and our backgrounds. Those are the 4 corners. You're also going to have FGs, which are flying geese. And then there's a few other ones as we go along, and I will explain them every week when we hit them. But that's what an HST is, half square triangle, which is this unit right here. So we're just going to move the camera around onto this side, and we are going to cut our fabric.
Arthur, Ontario is north of Guelph.
Oh, cool. Did you want to move your camera around over here?
Oh, yes.
Just give us a second. Probably,
Trying to shuffle.
yeah. Probably from now on, when we come, you might not see my face. You might just be zoomed in on the table, and then we won't have to move the cameras. But I thought we would chat a little bit today. So I have my paper, and I'm going to do my cutting. I have my blue squares, my blue fabric that I have here, and it says I need 2 5.5-inch squares. So that would be 5.5 by 5.5. I don't like using my block for that. I will either use my long ruler or did I bury my other? There it is. A square. If I'm cutting a lot of fabric or a lot of squares at one time, let me just move this out of the way here a bit. I will cut a whole strip off and then cut my fabric down. But because I only need 2 and I love being frugal for my fabric, I am just going to cut out the individual squares. Oops, we forgot to turn the phone off. Alrighty. So because it's a half square, a fat quarter, and it has just cut edges. They may not be straight. The only thing I can think of that's straight right now is the selvage on the one end. So I could take and cut myself some straight edges if I wanted to and work from there, but I'm just going to do this. So we need 2 5-inch squares. So I am going to take my 5-inch line and have it somewhere on the fabric, and my other 5-inch line is going to be somewhere, but on my blue fabric. I want to make sure that I cut off the selvage. We never use and leave selvage in our quilts. It shrinks differently than the rest of the fabric, and it could cause some puckering. So I'm just going to use my 6-inch line, and I'm going to put it on the edge of my selvage. My 5-inch line is a little bit up, and I'm going to cut. I'm going to support that corner right there, making sure that my ruler doesn't slip. When I have my cutter, depending on whichever one you have, whether it's a big one, whether it's a small one, there's the bumpy part. Put your finger on that. Make sure that you're cutting with your cutter perpendicular. You don't want to cut at an angle. When you do that, you're going to want to shift. Your ruler will end up shifting. So let's line that back up. And we're going to cut, supporting my corner so my fabric doesn't move. I'm going to cut 1 and 2. So now I have an oversized square. This corner's perfect. So my upper right-hand corner, I'm going to put down into the bottom left. Now I'm going to line up my 5-inch lines on my fabric. When I line up a line, you probably can't zoom in there that close. I don't want to make sure my line have beside my fabric. I want to make sure that my line is on top of my fabric. I don't want to see fabric on this side of the line. So again, this line is nice on the edge of my fabric. This one's nice on top of my fabric. Support that corner. Cut right off. When I cut at a corner, if I start here, I have a tendency to nick the corner. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to butt my corner up against my ruler. I'm going to rock it back and cut. So there is our 1 5-inch square. I need 2. So I am just going to continue on, whether I want to cut this way, whether I want to cut that way. This was a nice straight cut. So I am going to put my 5-inch line on that cut. Again, just to say that it's on top of the fabric with no fabric on the right side of that line. Cut and cut. If you are, I never did tell you that I always cut with my 1 and my 1 in my upper right-hand corner. And that way I will have the proper lines on my ruler as opposed to cutting on this side and then they're halves and I have a hard time remembering where the lines are. If you are left-handed, you will have the 1 1 in your upper left-hand corner. And you would just be cutting identically to this. And because I'm not left-handed, I have a hard time setting it up. But I would do it like that, cut and cut. So, Tiff's back. She had to sneak out for a second. Okay, Pat, the fabric requirements are in the files as of this morning at 10 o'clock. I put them up there. So I don't know if you've looked recently, but that's where they were.
They were on a post.
The background color, the larger amount of light that we have, or one of the lighter fat quarters. Not the larger amount of the white that you have. That again is for that block. We want to use some of the ones that are in our fat quarters, or I also added to mine a little bit of a grunge tone on tone. I can show you. Just gonna scoot that over here. Just went into my stash and I added an extra But the ones that are on the cutting instructions, the 2 meters, that's for those blocks. You're just going to put that aside. Alrighty. So I cheated a little bit and I have the rest of my cutting done. How's our picture there?
Yeah, I'm just going to check the files.
Okay. So Tiff's doing that as we're going to start sewing. So the first thing we're going to do is make our half square triangles. Where's our paper? I lost my paper. We'll figure out how to do this eventually. That probably doesn't show, eh?
I can't show all of that at once.
No. Okay. Never mind. We won't even worry about that. So I have all my fabrics. Also, on our paper, I did write peach, blue, light, and background just to coordinate with the colors that I have on the diagram. But that doesn't mean that you have to use blue and peach in your quilt. You're just going to decide on your fabrics which one you're going to do. So what Tiff ended up doing in her fat quarter bundle, she looked at the block and she said, well, I wanted to add a few more browns. So she picked up some brown because her couch and stuff is brown. So she had added a few more colors to her bundle. So she went into the bundle and we pressed everything with our starch and lots of steam. So we're going to set our color. That's also going to help give us some stability, that starch, especially if you've washed your fabrics. If you starch them, we'll get some stiffness out. So we're not going to get as a lot of stretch when we're doing the anything on a diagonal or a bias. So when Tiff decided on her blocks, she looked at the paper with this. So this is her background color. Her star points are the blue and the beige, and she's going to have a dark center. She decided she wanted the dark as opposed to the light. So you're going to look at your fabrics and you are just going to decide what you want in your block. And that's going to be the same as we go every week. We are going to probably just, look at what we've done. Once we have 3 or 4 blocks, I love putting them up on the wall and saying, okay, I use this fabric and this fabric and this fabric, and I'm going to this block, I'm going to pick this one and this one. And it just keeps it a little bit more organized, but make sure that we don't have always the same fabrics in each block.
I just checked the files and the block one instructions definitely are there. Well, cutting instructions.
Okay. So you can see I have peach and I have blue. These are for my half square triangles. My background squares are going to be this little polka dot. So I didn't use a solid white. I'm going to use one of the prints that is in my bunch.
Yes, Martine, the YouTube live stream will be archived. You will be able to access it after the live. We're probably going to leave them up for most of the year.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing with that, don't forget that we see live comments now, but if you're watching later on, once in a while, I do like to see if there's any more comments, but we won't be able to ask questions. That's what we have that Facebook group for. So make sure that you join the Facebook group. And if, as you're sewing your block, you come up with problems when we're not on live, ask your questions there. I check those regularly, as well as there's always going to be somebody there that might be able to answer your question if I'm not there. And it's always nice to see. So I want to see all these blocks next week or during the week as you have them done. I want to see your colors and what you've chosen. So we're going to make our half square triangles. And a half square triangle block is just a square that's cut in half, triangle, and triangle. So we're going to be using these fabrics. Okay, old school. If you've seen a pattern and it says cut your squares at 4 7/8, then sew your half square triangles, cut them into triangles and sew. If you cut perfectly and sew absolutely perfectly, you will have perfect 4.5-inch triangle, half square triangles when you're finished. Too much trying to be perfect for me. Okay, something's definitely wrong here. So you can see it doesn't even match. Let me check my 5-inch square. My 5-inch square is now 5.25. Easy to cut off more fabric. If it would have been the other way, I can't add fabric, so I would have had to cut it in the other direction. That's why I was hoping it was this one. Okay, so I don't like cutting 4 7/8. That's a really precise line. I have to cut on those little tiny little lines, and it leaves me no fudge room. So every time that I see a finished block, say this one will be finished at 4.5, or at 4, sorry. This unit here, it says trim to 4.5. So once we have a 1/4-inch seam allowance and a 1/4-inch seam allowance, that means our block, once it's sewn into the project, will measure 4. So when I see a half square triangle block, even if the pattern says cut 4 7/8, I up it to the inch. So this is a 4-inch finished. I am going to cut a 5-inch square. Then I'm going to trim them down. So now, even if I don't sew perfectly, I am going to look perfect. 2 ways to mark your half square triangles. I don't mind using a friction marker at this point because it's on the back of our fabric. And if the line does come back in the cold a little bit, it's not going to show. I never use them on the front of a quilt for marking my quilts. This is a magic wand. It has a line down the center. You can line that line.
Could you use the other 2 corners?
This way?
Yes.
Okay. You're going to take that center line of the wand, line them up with the lines of your corners, and you are going to mark. Make sure you don't mark with your pen up. You want to be as close to that wand as you can. And then I am going to also mark this way. So now when I sew, I'm just going to, because I have the thickness of a pen, I'm just going to sew on the inside of that mark. The other way that we can mark is, will this measure? No, not long enough. Okay, I'll just use this. I'm just going to draw one line from corner to corner. And now I'm going to sew on either side of those.
I'm just going to zoom in here. Just to make sure they get a chance to see what you're talking about, where you do those. So one's a 1/4 inch away from the corner and the other is right on the one.
Exactly. This magic wand, I didn't say, is a 1/2 inch wide with the line down the center. So each edge of the line is a 1/4 inch away. So you're basically drawing a 1/4 inch away from that line.
Someone mentioned the 1/4 inch tape. Do you want to touch on that quickly?
The 1/4 inch tape.
Why you're not using it right now?
This one, I absolutely love this for marking. Instead of marking here, I actually add this to my sewing machine. I'll take my foot off. I will align.
Do you want me to come over there?
Can you come over a little bit? Yeah.
It's going to take me a second, but I should.
Yeah, because I think if you can work over here a little bit, it might be a little bit easier. We found out that the cord for our camera to our computer is only about a foot and a bit long. We have to go purchase another cord. So this is the seam tape seam diagonal seam tape, and it has a red line down the center and a black line a 1/4 inch away. So what I'm going to do is I took my foot off so I can see exactly where my needle is. I am going to align this red strip up with the center and make sure that it's straight. So now what I can do is I can follow the edge of my square with the edge of the tape. Let me just put my foot back on. Works really good if I have small 2.5 inch, 3 inch squares that I'm working with. However, with this one, it's long off the edge of my sewing machine. So that's why I opted not to use the diagonal seam tape. So I'm going to take my two colors from my half square triangle, line one upside front, one.
I think I'm too zoomed in.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. So right sides together. And I am going to sew on these lines. So the first one that we marked, right side together. If you want, we can put a pin in there to hold it together for us. And now I am going to sew just to say I'm on the inside of that line. When I get to this end, I've got my needle in the down position. I can pull this out.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So I've sewn just on the side of the line, pulled this out. Now I'm going to sew on this line. Again, holding my thread with my fingers as I start. And down we go. Here's one thing, because I'm going to sew another block, I'm going to leave this in here just like that. And that's going to hold my loose threads. Now I can take my other block. So I know as if it was the edge of my fabric. I'm going to consider the line the edge of my fabric as if I was sewing blocks together like I did those stripes. I'm just going to use the edge of my 1/4 inch foot. I'm aligning it up.
I'm sorry, Barb, is what measurement going to be posted online? The cutting instructions are already posted in our Facebook group.
So I cut down to the end. I'm just going to pull it up, flip around, sew up here. I always like to sew with my needle in the down position because it locks my fabric in. I can stop. I can cut this piece off. I didn't even bother pinning this one. I'm living dangerously. So again, I'm just lining that edge of my 1/4 inch foot up with the center line. So now we have the two methods, whether I sewed on a line or whether I sewed on either side of the line. All I'm going to do now is cut from corner to corner. If this doesn't measure exactly 1/4 inch, no problem. It's our seam that's inside. No one's going to see whether it's off. We're good with that. And there we go. So now what we have to do is do some pressing. We always normally press to the dark if we can, unless the pattern tells us differently. So I am going to press towards the blue. They're pretty much the same value, so it really doesn't matter one way or the other which way that I press these. I'm just going to press them all the same. So when I press, I don't like to use steam. Let me just turn my steam off, and I'm just going to charge up my iron there.
Do you need to lock your iron base?
No, it's too heavy that way. Yeah. Remember now that this is, can you see, where are you zoomed in there, Tiff?
Yep.
Okay. So this edge right now that's cut is a bias edge, and it's very stretchy. That's also why we like to sew when we're doing half square triangles. We like to sew that before we cut it. Makes our life a whole lot easier. If you've ever tried to do a pattern and it says cut the triangles, sew them together, and then this is kind of riffly, that's one of the reasons why. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set my seam. And all that means is that I am going to be pressing my fabric, and it's just embedding my thread into the seam. If I took this one that's not pressed in, if I felt it, it's bumpy. Here, it's nice and smooth. It's into my fabric. I'm going to open my seam. Because I want my seam pressed towards my blue, I have my blue on the top. And you can see that the seam will automatically press towards the blue. Because it's again a bias, I can really make sure that I can really stretch it. So I want to make sure that it's open nicely, and I'm going to press. I'm not going to iron like this. I'm not going to catch that seam. I don't want to stretch it. I don't want to see my stitches, and I don't want to have any of that little foldy over. I want to make sure that it's open all the way and give it a nice press. And I'm going to do the other 4. Is there any questions, Tiff? You can see on this one, it didn't line up quite right to the edge. Not a problem because I have my fudge room built in.
Camp Quilter asks, is it good to use the wool mat on top of the cutting board?
Because I'm not ironing with steam, it doesn't hurt it at all. Again, depends on the thickness and the quality of your wool mat. There's a whole lot of different qualities out there. So I personally haven't any problem. I've never had heat that comes through, but I'm not steaming. If I was steaming on my wool mat, I would definitely not have it over top of my cutting board. Also, when I am pressing all my fat quarters, when I'm doing multiple, all the fabrics steaming and starching, that kind of stuff, I use my ironing board. And then I don't use this at all. Well, I do have a wool mat on my ironing board. But
yeah. It's just bigger.
It's just bigger. Alrighty, so I have my 4 blocks. Just gonna put this to the side. And there we go. So now we have to square these up. Couple different rulers that we can use with this. So most everybody has the traditional ruler. And I'm going to have to stand up because I just cannot cut. I just hope I don't. That's all right.
No, I'm just going to slightly.
All right. I can't cut properly, accurately sitting down. I want to stand up and I want to be on top of my work. So, regular square ruler for cutting. They almost always have a diagonal line, and I want to cut with my 1-1 in the upper right-hand corner. If I'm lefty, I am just going to flip it around, and I'm going to cut with my 1-1 in my upper right-hand corner, or left-hand corner. All right. So here we go. I want to make sure that my diagonal line is exactly on my allowance. I want to have a little bit of fabric on the outside of my ruler, and I want to make sure that there's a little bit of fabric on the outside of what I'm trimming to. On our paper, it says we're trimming our half square units to 4.5 by 4.5. Cut and cut. Okay, so now this corner is perfect. So my upper right-hand corner, I'm going to put it in the bottom left-hand corner. Now I'm going to take the 4.5 inch line, and it's the white line. Our inch is marked in quarter, half, 3/4, and then the full inch. So I'm going to take the 1/2 inch line. These creative grid rulers have these little, what I call chicken feet. It will go right on your corner. And again, just as I said when I was cutting my blocks, I want to make sure that those lines of my ruler are on top of my fabric. It's just going to give me that extra thread that I need that's going to be taken up with our fold of our seam allowance. Then I am going to cut this way and this way. So that's if you have just a regular square, not a big issue. My favorite ruler.
Have your rotating cutting board up there too, if you'd like.
Oh, awesome. So my favorite ruler is this block lock ruler. It has this groove in the middle, and what it's going to do is lock onto my seam. So if you were here, I would tell you to push it, but you'll have to trust me. When you push it sideways, you can see that it locks totally onto that seam and it finds that center mark for me. So my seam is going to stay perfectly centered the way I want. We always want to make sure that seam goes exactly from corner to corner. So with this ruler, I'm just going to flip it around for you for a minute. If I lock it on my seam, and you can see my corner is not lined up with my seam allowance, I have my ruler upside down. So I'm just going to flip it around, lock it on my seam. I'm going to slide the ruler up so I have a little bit of a fabric over top of this 4.5 or outside the 4.5, a little bit of fabric on the top and on the bottom. I'm going to put a little bit of pressure here. You'll notice with this ruler too, it doesn't rock like the other one did. When I was holding this ruler, I wanted to make sure that I always hold that corner because it's up for the seam and it rocks a little bit. This one sits nice and flush. Again, same cutting, straight up. I'm going to roll my seam back or my cutter back. I think I need a new blade in my cutter. I'm not going to pick up my ruler and my fabric at this time. I want to rotate the whole thing. Really great with that cutting board. I'm just going to rotate it around. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to slide it down. I am going to align that 4.5 inch line on my seam. Seam. Still there. This time I'm putting a little bit of pressure in this direction. Cut, cut, and I have a perfect block. Exactly the same as the other one, just works just a little bit better. If you bought the set of the block lock, it came with a 4.5. I think mine's at home right now. I don't have it here. But with the joys of the 4.5, you put it on there. You just cut, cut, rotate, cut, cut, and it would be absolutely perfect. I do have a little creative grid here. Again, it is a 4.5. That's the joys of the little rulers. I don't have to think about the lines. I place it on so there's fabric all the way around and I just cut. And you can see that this one slides a little bit. This one, not so much. So my 4.5s around, cut up, cut back, cut over, rotate, slide it down, aligning my 4.5 and my 4.5, cut, cut. And one more. Again, I knew that this one come off my board in this direction with the blue at the bottom, so I automatically took this block, put the blue at the bottom. Got fabric all the way around. Sometimes you have a little bit more, sometimes you have a little bit less, depends on how accurate you were with your sewing. Rotate it around, rotate it down.
A couple people say love the block locks.
Yeah, they're wonderful block locks. It's changed how we quilt. You know, at one time it was just like we tried to be so perfect all the time. And now with these special tools, we don't have to try so hard, but we still are perfect at the end of the day. So there's my scrap for those 4 blocks. I think that that's not wasteful of the fabric. I just think that's taking pressure off, allowing me to enjoy what I'm doing and being perfect at the end of the day. Any questions about half square triangles? Okay, now remember, this block, ladies, is the easiest block that we're going to be doing. I have my little design board here, and now I'm going to just set out my block according to our diagram. Okay. So I have my center square. I have my 4 corners. And if you had fabric that you were worried about direction, you would make sure they're going in the right direction. I am not worrying about that at all. So you have an option. You can either put the pink one for the star or the peach one, or you could put the other color as your star. I'm going to follow along with the paper just so it's a little bit easier to understand. So I am going to align my first block with my fabric that I want the star to be, butting against my center and my left-hand side. Now, to get them spinning in the proper direction, all I have to do is line this one up exactly right, and we're going to rotate it 90 degrees to this side. This one here, lined up the same, rotate it 90 degrees to that side, 90 degree to that side, and we have our friendship star. So now all I'm going to do is sew them together in rows and sew my rows together. First one. So when I sew my blocks together, I want to make sure that I'm sewing the proper seam. So if I take it like this and always take my one on my right, close it like a book, and I'm going to sew this seam right here. If I did it the other way, I would have to take it and flip it around and try to remember by the time I get to my sewing machine what side that I'm going to sew. Which, as the weeks go, I'm probably going to mess up a few of them and we'll have to unsew. That's just part of quilting. So, block on the right to the block on the left. I'll line these up and we're going to sew. I don't think that's going to bother anybody. So you can pin if you like. This time I'm not going to pin, I'm just going to hold it. Here's a little tip for you. Have you ever sewn your blocks and they get caught on the seams? You end up getting rat's nests underneath. Couple ways to fix that. Right now, I have what's called a straight stitch plate in my machine. I have a teeny tiny little hole instead of that long slotted one. So it's not going to push the fabric down in there. If your corner of your fabric wants to go down into your machine, you probably have to change your needle. I started a new project, so I changed it. That being said, we change it quite often because somebody's always sewing with the machine. Secondly, if you have a little piece of fabric, you can use, some people call them a peg. I just call it a starter and a stopper. So what I'm going to do is sew just to the edge of my fabric. I love sewing with my needle in the down position. This foot automatically lifts it. The foot automatically lifts up. If yours doesn't, you would lift your foot. Now I can take this, make sure they're still staying
a little closer 1 second.
Okay.
Joys of live.
Okay. So now that my foot is up, I can butt this right up close to my needle, aligning up exactly where I can see, and I can start sewing. And it's going to be cranky here. There we go. But I want to make sure my edges stay lined up. I'm going to hold them with this finger, and I'm going to guide it with this hand. If I just let it slide through my... Let me just finish this, and I'll talk to you in a second. I always want to guide my fabric with my fingers. If I let it go or if I let it slide, it's going to move wherever it wants to. If I'm pulling back here, well, that's too late. I've already sewn that. There's no reason why we want to pull. Our feed dogs are supposed to be doing what it is. So I like to support it with my left hand, and my left hand continues holding it where I want it to be. all the way through. If you are afraid of your sewing machine, or somebody stole my, oh, there it is, got it. Our fingers are fat. We can always use something like a stiletto or this purple thing, and I can hold my fabric here and I can make sure that it stays exactly lined up with the edge of my foot. Next one, I'm going to my block. Again, I'm going to take my center block, flip it over to the top one. I am going to align these up. I could also, making sure that I know that it's the seam, I could always flip it and sew on this side, and then we're not starting on a thick seam. I'm going to show you why I'm doing it this way in a second. It moved. I'm just going to realign it, make sure everything's lined up nicely, and off I go. And then again, if I want to, I can hold it like that. My third row, flipping it over, aligning up this. So now instead of cutting my thread, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that starter stopper. I'm going to slip it in there. I'm going to sew to this edge. Now I'm just going to cut with my sewing machine. It's ready to go for my next block. So this is the block that came out of the sewing machine. That's the last one I sewed. So you can see these are all in the correct order. We can either press now, or I can sew these blocks on here and then press after. So I think that's what I'm going to do so I can sew my rows together. So again, the one on the right, over to the left, and off we go. Next one. And our final row.
Is there any questions at this point?
Just going to grab my leader. Actually, what I'm going to do is what I normally do is have two leaders, one on the start and one on the stop. Again, there's my last block. I know that's my bottom row. This one, and then this one. So now off we go to the pressing. Thank you. Don't you love when I sew? I have this magic mat that magically appears. Alrighty, so pressing. Theoretically, most of the time when we say
Beginner question, thread type and color recommendations.
awesome. I love Aurifil thread. It is a, can you get me a spool there just to show them?
Definitely.
So it is a 50 weight Egyptian cotton, very, very low lint, and it's very fine. So when I press and set that into the seam, it really butts in really, really nicely. Thank you. Do you have a gray?
Actually,
there?
I'm just gonna, there you go.
This one. Yeah, these are about the same. So depending on what your fabrics are, can you go get a 2710 and a dark gray? Yeah.
I can get you a 2370.
2370, yeah. These are the 3 colors that I do 99.9% of my piecing with. Either a cream. Today I'm using one that's a little darker, just hopefully so you can see the seam. That's my bobbin thread. Darker. But I would piece with that. Other fabrics, I'll use either a gray or this. It's called, the color number is 2370. It's kind of this khaki color. Best for batiks. It seems to blend in with everything. When you press properly, you will not see your thread. See your seam at all, your thread. I could really be sewing with something darker here because it's a light fabric. A black or something wouldn't show in. But 99% of my sewing, I use those two, one of those. Unless it's a white quilt, I use white. Or if it's a black quilt, I use black. But other than that, this is what I do all my piecing with.
So basically a neutral, yes. And this is 100% cotton thread as well.
When my daughter was little, she used to call me a cotton because I like good quality cotton. I like piecing with my cotton threads. I do use polyesters for long arming, for quilting, that kind of stuff, for embroidery work. But when I'm piecing, I really love the cotton threads. Okay. Anything else? Did you notice anything else?
I just want to show a little why that 2370 is good, because that's what I'm going to be using mostly for mine. It looks a lot darker on those light fabrics that she has out, but it blends in really nicely when you've got more rich colors.
And again, also batik. I think I always use that one when I'm using batiks. Was there any other questions? Please ask me questions, and don't be afraid to ask them if you're a newbie. We all asked these questions before, or there's somebody sitting back there that doesn't want to ask, that will go, oh, I'm glad she asked that. Okay, so on to pressing. Most rule of thumb is we always press towards the dark. In this case scenario, our darks are half square triangles. This block here doesn't have a seam. Our seam is going to want to go away from the thing. So it'll want to go away from the corner. Why struggle with it to try to get it in the other way? I am just going to press my seams in the towards our solid square, away from our seam. One little point for the newbie, if you look at my seam right there, because while my corner doesn't go to the corner anymore, did I do something wrong? Did I trim something wrong? Nope. That's just going to be your next seam allowance. Okay. So let's press. So my first seam, I want to press towards my white, my background color.
You didn't mention your rows interlocking.
Ah, okay. I will do that on the next one. So this one I want to press this way. So again, I'm going to set the seam. I'm going to open this up with my finger. I love the wool mat. It also helps. It collects the steam. It collects the heat. So it's like you're pressing from both sides. But it also sort of grips your fabric. If you ever worked on a felt board before, it grips your fabric so things don't shift as much. Flip it around to this side. Again, making sure that it's all the way open with my fingers and pressing. So this one I want to press towards the center for 2 reasons. One, again, it's away from that seam. It's the way it's going to want to sew. But I want to press my seams opposite what it is in the other row. So I press towards the white. These ones I want to press in the opposite direction. So they'll go in. These ones went out, and the bottom one will also go out. And they will lock in when we put our rows together. I will show that again in a minute. So this block I want to again press towards my center. So I am going to put my center square up to the top. set my seam, open it up, press. I'm going to flip it around and do this side. Normally, I don't have my iron set up at my sewing station. It's just because of videotaping. It's a little easier. I really like to have it away. So I do these three things. Take my board, go to the iron at the cutting board, makes me get up and stretch my back, and I don't get quite so stiff. Get a few steps in anyways without going outside. Again, so my second row, or I'm sorry, my third row, I'm going to again press towards our solid squares. My background on top. Backwards. So at this point, I'm going to pause for a second, and I am going to again test my block. This measurement here, because all our blocks are 12.5 inches, it should measure 12.5. Just going to grab my ruler here. It's so much easier at this point if I have to adjust it at this point. I am out, let me see. I am out just a smidgen on this side. I am just going to double press this and make sure that I don't have any fold over. And see if that makes a difference. And there we have it. I'm at 12.5.
We might have a little delivery interruption. So,
ooh, is it fabric? Is it? That one works. And that one's a little short. Let me just double check this pressing. Oh, I can see a fold over on this end. So much easier to catch it now than sew our whole block together and have to unsew. There I am. I'm perfect again. Okay, so now I'm going to sew my rows together. And here's where we talk about nesting seams. I'm going to take my top one and I'm going to press it to this, or I'm sorry, I'm going to fold it towards the center, and I want to sew this seam. Just going to move this away. What we want to do, I don't know how close you are here. I want to make sure that, of course, my edges are lined up, but I want to make sure that this seam lines up perfectly with the one below it. If I line this up and I feel a real lump there, I know that it's not lined up properly, and I will wiggle my fingers and I can feel now all of a sudden it's locked right in. If there was a gap, it might be like way off, then we'd have to move it in the other direction. Because we're matching seams, it's a really great place to pin. Can you see how the seam matches there?
I mean, I don't know if they can.
So I've butted those seams so they're perfect. If I had my seams in the same direction, you would see that you would have like 2, 4, 8 layers of fabric there. Really hard to get a nice seam. So I am going to pin that seam. Again, butting these together, I feel a lump. Oh, look, my seam is flipped. I am just going to fix that right now. If I didn't notice it right now and I left it, it's not the end of the world unless you're a hand quilter. If you're a hand quilter, you want to make sure that they're all going there to reduce the bulk. But if we're machine quilting them, we'll be okay. So I only clipped the seam here, but I sewed way down there just to lock that in again, so it's not going to come undone. Alrighty. Now I'm just going to wiggle this and jiggle it until I know you can't feel my fingers, but I can feel that there's no lump there now. And if we look, our seams will be lined up absolutely perfectly. When I pin, I'm going to pin on this side of the seam because this is my seam allowance that is in the bottom that I can't see. So I always want to pin the seam allowance in that direction to remind me to make sure that it's going in the right direction. This one's going down, this one's going up, so I pinned at that one. I can also align up the edges. And I'm going to align up this one. And I'll just put this down a little bit from the edge so I can start sewing. As we trimmed our units, everything should be identical in size, so they will fit perfectly without a baggy part. If for some reason this one was a little baggy, we could have that on the bottom, and our feed dogs will help feed it in. Any questions on seam, cutting, or pinning them?
So again, someone's asking about the cutting instructions. The link is not working. You may have to be a member of the Facebook group in order for the link to work. The link on the Facebook group definitely does work. We have confirmed that. So the YouTube link, I'm not that doesn't seem to be working for some reason, but the one on Facebook does.
Once we're finished live, we will try to relink it on our YouTube channel. But the one on Facebook is working as far as we know. Okay. So now that I've pinned 2 seams, let me talk about that for a second.
Louise says, do you pin in the center or the side of the seam?
I pin just to the side of the seam, and I pin on the side that my seam allowance is on the back, making sure that my back seam allowance is going in the right direction. So theoretically, I would pin there. This one just shifted. Make sure that that's lined up. It's really, really close to the seam allowance.
Can we get a decent, okay, there we go.
As I'm sewing as well, I'm just going to talk about pinning a little bit. These FAF machines, I forget sometimes, but these FAF machines are really great because they have the IDT, which is integrated dual feed, which is like sewing with a walking foot. So I have this other lever that pulls my top fabric and my bottom fabric at the same time, so I don't get as much shifting.
The link will be posting after the live stream. We'll make sure that it's accessible even if you don't have Facebook.
So sometimes if you're sewing with a regular or another sewing machine that doesn't have that feature, by the time we get to the bottom, our top fabric will be puckery. I want to make sure that I don't just take the pin out and move that pucker down. Now my seams will not be aligned up. I always want to make sure that those seams stay aligned. I want to make sure that there's any bulk that it stays within those 2 seams. And I will show you as we go. Okay, so let's get started. I drop my pin at the beginning just so I can butt it up right against my needle. And off I go. I don't like to sew through a pin, so I will take this pin out. That's why I like sewing with my needle in the down position. So it's locking my fabric in so I can adjust things and it's not going to move. Oh, one other thing that I forgot about it when we started, I like to sew with a 2.0 seam allowance Because we're not back stitching, I don't want that thread buildup or anything to back stitch at a front and a back of seam. If I reduce my stitches, my seams don't come apart at those beginnings and endings. So I will always have this sewn into another project. It will always have another seam locking these at the end of the day. But right now I don't want to do the back stitching. So now that I've started, I want to make sure my seam is nicely lined up. I'm going to hold that in my right hand. I want to make sure that my fabric hasn't moved, that it's aligned up right on my fabric, on the edge, the two layers together. And off I go. When I get to about this spot, every sewing machine that I know of has a lip here. It's going to catch the seam allowance if it's going up towards the foot. I want to make sure I stop and make sure my seam allowance is going in the right direction. My edges are aligned, my seam's going in the right direction, and I'm going to sew to my pin. Again, I want to take my pin so it's out of the way, but it's still holding that seam together. I don't want to lose that nice join that I marked on, so that I've tried so hard to pin. So I am just going to sew up to my pin and take my pin out. Once I get past my, again, I'll align up my edge, sew half my block, make sure that seam allowance on this side is going in the direction that it's supposed to. I can feel my seam is still lined up. Adjust my pin. I wish you could see. I don't think you can. I'll show you after I finish sewing. Again, little tug, straight. Again, corners want to shift, so I am going to just hold it with my pin. Slow my speed down so what my seam at that corner doesn't shift. I could see right here, this is my half square triangle. I don't know. You can see that this seam comes in this direction. This seam comes in that direction. When I press, I wanted just to say that I'm on the point of that seam, on the point of that corner, sorry. That's going to ensure that I don't cut the nose off of my little triangle. So now if I did it right, I should peek first. I'll let you see. Because I pressed, my seam runs down. Because I press my seams in opposite directions, it looks as if it flows right straight from one to the other. And we can press this one. It doesn't really matter one way or the other now because they have corners. This one has two. This one has one. So I'm probably going to sew my, or press my seams away from those two. This way I only have the one heavy corner that's going to be a little cranky. Again, set my seam. I pulled like this. My seam went in the wrong direction because there is a corner here, that extra bulk. It's going to automatically want to fold down. So I want to make sure that that stays in the right direction. I can hit that corner. Again, here I can feel that there's a funny bump there. My seam's going in the wrong direction. There's my center block. And on this one, I'm just going to hold it with my iron, make sure my seam is going in the right direction, and give it a press. If I flip it over, take a look at this time, I can make sure that it's going in the right direction. So our next one, again, making sure that that pink one is beside my center square. I'm going to flip it up, and because this is a larger square, I'm going to start sewing here and go that way. Again, I like to pin my edges. Wiggle, wiggle. because there's a lump in there. Aligning this seam. Again, I don't know that you can see. It lines up really nicely. Now I'm going to grab this one. I have a seam, so I'm going to make sure that that seam is going in the direction that I want it to go in. And there. So I've got those seams butted up. My seam allowances are going in the opposite directions. And off I go. Focus isn't even too bad. Good? Yeah. Up to my pin. I'm going to make sure my edges align. I trust that I pin correctly, but I never trust the fabric to stay where I want it to stay. I always make sure before I sew it that it's adjusted again, even if I've pinned all the way through. Make sure my seam allowance is all nice over there. Holding it, keeping it aligned. Again, I can see right here, I've got a that crossover seam there. I want to make sure that my seam, my 1/4 inch, should measure right at that 1/4 inch if we squared up our blocks properly. So we're going to press the seam again. I press this one out. I can press this one out again as well because I have those 2 corners so that it's going to want to press out anyways. Again, set our seam. Make sure that that corner is lying flat. And off we go. Moment of truth and reckoning. Now that my block is finished and all my seams are secure, now I like to just give it a nice steam press so everything's nice and flat. I can grab my 12.5 inch ruler. I don't have a creative grid. I don't know if this one's going to show you very well. Where is my 12.5? This dotted line is my 12.5 inch line. So I'm going to put that on the edge of my fabric. I'm going to put that on the edge of my fabric. And I'm going to check these 2 sides then. And see that my block is indeed 12.5. Again, if it's not, I can't take the ruler and square this up. So if this was measuring, more than the 12.5, we can't, because we will lose the points of our star. Because when we sewed it together, we made sure that they were squared up properly. This point is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So if our block was too big and we squared it up, we're taking that seam allowance off. So when we sew it to the next block, we're going to lose the point. So if our block is too big at this point, we're going to take one of those seams that we just sewed and take a bigger seam. If our block is too small, if it's too small by say a 1/16 of an inch, I will take steam and I will just give my seams another pressing. And a lot of times you can get that 1/16 of an inch. I can even give it a little spray with our spray starch if we have to. And give that little, it'll just relax the fabric a little bit, and then we can press it out and get about a 1/16 of an inch if our block's too small. If that doesn't work,
or if it's more than a 1/16 of an inch small, you can't do it.
If it's more than a 16, no, you can't be stretching an 1/8 or something like that. So then you might have to take your seam out and resew with just a thread smaller of a seam. So there we have it, block 1. We still have some time that we can answer some questions. And I'd like to show you again, remember Tiff's colors? There is her block. It really actually looks totally different, but it's the same block. So it's amazing to see the different colorways on how the blocks look. I hope I was clear, but is there any more questions? This is one of the most simplest blocks that we have. That's why we started here, because I knew I wanted to talk more on seam allowance and seams and our sewing and our cutting. So I did want to make sure that I had some time. So we will get progressively a little bit more difficult as our weeks go. But
Thanks,
it's
Linda.
Always fun to start with a easy block. None of the blocks are totally hard because we're breaking them down into little units and we're scoring up our units as we go. Now, if there's any other questions right now, or if you think of them as you're starting to sew, get on that Facebook group and ask your questions, because that's why we're here. We want to answer. We want everybody's quilting journey to be fun and exciting.
We will try and answer some questions on YouTube, but we're definitely going to see them sooner if you message on the Facebook group or if you comment on the Facebook group. So will we be doing our cutting in advance from now on?
You can. Yes, I think so, because they're all just regular squares and stuff. If you want to sew along with me as we go at the same time, then definitely you will need to do the cutting.
There will be a few that I know we had dual cutting instructions. So some of those ones, they may want to wait.
Yeah. Another thing that I know that when I did my ribbon candy block of the month with the ladies, what they like to do is when we were the first video, they just watched it, asked questions, the question came into their mind. Then they grabbed it and did the not live, but it's still going to be up there. So you can use your iPad, prop it up, and then sew along with me after the fact.
Rita said how many weeks?
So we have 12 blocks, 1 block a week. If you want to do the queen size, it's your opportunity. You have to do 2 blocks a week. And then we're going to have the 13th week, we're going to do the setting, and then one more week.
While you were touching on that, someone said, what size does the 12 block make? You were in the, yeah.
Sure. So the 12 block quilt, let me just get my paper.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not at all.
Back into your weeks discussion.
So the 12 blocks with this setting works out to be 58 by 75. So a really nice lap size quilt. If you make, let me just see, I think I have the pattern here.
Where'd it go?
There it is. If you make 24 blocks, you will end up with this layout. You will have a quilt that is 96.5 by 96.5. There's about. If you think that's just too much work for you and you only want to make 6 blocks, that works out to be 41 by 58, which sounds like a pretty nice baby quilt size. And then you can choose your 6 of your favorite blocks. The other setting that we have, if you don't want to do the chain block, and it's easy as well, but if you don't want to do that much piecing, we have this hourglass block that you can use for an alternate setting. The sizes will still be the same. If you just want to do a simple sashing in between the blocks, that's an option. I did this, which is just a simple sashing, but I put folded corners on my sashing strips, ended up with these really cool stars. And this one for the 12 blocks measures 43 by 54. We'll go along after on week 13 about which setting that we want to do.
So if you wanted to touch back to how many weeks?
So 12 blocks, 12 weeks, 1 a week. We will have 1 week to make the setting squares and triangles, and then we will have another week just to put it all together and talk about how to put borders on properly. Once we have our blocks done, that doesn't mean we're blocked. We can hurry up and put the borders on and be done. They need a little bit of care as well. There was something else. It's lost me now. I don't know if somebody can read my mind, ask me that question so I can answer it again.
So Martine asked, what thread color would you have used sewing the ribbon candy quilt? I'm assuming she's using some of the same fabrics.
Yeah. So there's a little block that I made with my scraps from my ribbon candy. I just used that cream or a gray.
Yeah, I would probably use the light gray for that one, personally.
That light. A light gray or a little bit darker than that would work as well.
But I think on this one,
I think it's the gray.
Yeah. If I could get it to focus, it doesn't want to focus. Okay.
It's not going to focus.
No, it sometimes does. There we go. It's just the gray. And some of the seams are cream.
Sometimes I forget to change my thread color. I think
sometimes other people use your machine and change it and you have no idea it changed.
Yeah, exactly. So next week, I think I'm going to use just a little bit darker thread color just so you can see your seams a little bit more. And with proper pressing, you will see that you don't really see the color of the thread. Any other questions?
Martine says thank you. Let's see. Someone said that's a good point. Sewing with the 2.0 length, often if she sews the edge.
Exactly.
Which is exactly. And with that tiny block we just showed you, I think we sewed with a 1.5.
We did. Yeah.
Because when the smaller the piece and you're working on, it is sometimes better to use a smaller stitch length.
Because you can see.
Leanne says, I learned so much. Thank you.
Oh, you're quite welcome, Leanne. So you can see as we grab and pull, it will undo at the end. So the tighter the stitches, the smaller the stitches, the less that would happen.
Any other questions? Linda said she posted her picture to the Facebook group.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda.
And I am going to create a link to that file on our actual website, and then I will post that link here. That way you won't have to be part of the Facebook group, just for those that don't use Facebook. It will be available in the YouTube comments, or in the description of this video.
Yeah.
Shortly after the live stream.
So theoretically, according to YouTube, as far as we can tell, I can't just post a file in the description. It has to just take you as a link to someplace else. So just in case you're not on Facebook, that's what Tiff was saying, we'll link it to my website. So if you go on there, you'll be able to download it from there.
Okay, Linda says, I think I'll switch my blocks on the second block.
Are you making a queen size, Linda? It's really neat. If you do make a queen size, two things. Either just take these fabrics and switch them up using the same colors, or in my picture for my queen size, because it was just EQ, I just grabbed each block and just pasted it twice. But you could take totally different fabrics for each of your blocks, and they would never look like they were the same. So that's a really great point if you're doing the queen size one.
Oh, Rita said she was watching our hot dog pillowcase video and just happened to see we were live.
Awesome.
Okay, so we are coming up on an hour and a half, so I think we're going to cut it off here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I don't know about you, but this was a lot of fun for us. Next week, I think we're going to try and keep it to an hour.
Yeah.
Try and keep it a little shorter than this.
Exactly. Again, I'm not going to go over actually the cutting and stuff next week unless there's something specific that we have to do. So we're going to go straight into the sewing of the block. If you do have any more cutting questions and stuff, though, please send it to the Facebook group. So we will see you next Monday at 1 o'clock for block number 2. Happy quilting, everyone. Bye.